And it's also good to know that every written source we have, particularly on the Norse and Nordic side, is a secondary source, right? One of my favorite teachers of Seidr and of all things heathen is Trey Moonwood, and they refer to it as muddled monks, right? A lot of this was written down by muddled monks who were probably trying their best, but it was already 200 years after everything had happened, and then we have these Christian functionaries who are like, they say she was wearing cat skin. We're not sure. We're just going to write that down, right? Like there's a challenge here. So I think it is worth knowing that all Seidr construction is contemporary. All of it is a rooting into the past, but it is not a direct line. So it's okay to get in there and use your other metaphysical skills to fill in the blanks.
Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, JoAnna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. In this conversation, I was speaking with the wonderful Irene Glasse. Irene is a witch, heathen, musician, diviner, oracular Seidr practitioner, and teacher and ritualist from Western Maryland. I had the pleasure of first meeting Irene earlier this year at the Sacred Space Conference, which she is very much a part of and helps make happen each year. And I was, while at the conference, able to attend a wonderful Seidr ritual that she and her group led. It was a very powerful experience. Irene is also an organizer for Frederick CUUPS, which is a vibrant interfaith community which presents public rituals and a number of different spiritual supports for people of various pagan faiths. If you enjoy this episode, I hope that you will subscribe to the podcast and leave us a 5-star review. And be sure to check out our Coffee and Divination YouTube channel, which is quite new and where you can now watch the full video episodes of the show. If you're in the New York City area, I hope you will join us on June 20th, 2025, in Prospect Park for our Witch Day Camp, which will be a full day of rituals and workshops with the North Wyldewood Coven. I will be leading an intermediate level workshop on divination during it and would love to see you there. So now, on to our conversation with witch and Seidr practitioner Irene Glasse. So it is my pleasure to have on the show Irene Glasse, someone who I actually got to meet in person. Sometimes I have met guests on this show in person before, and I got to meet her at the wonderful Sacred Space Conference last month. So it is my pleasure to have you on the show, and thank you for making time for this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And it's lovely to get a chance to catch up, not when I'm also running a conference and my hair is actively on fire and screaming behind me.
Well, you didn't make it look like that. It looked so calm
good.
And put together, as
that
always.
Is my swan impersonation. His little feet paddling really furiously underneath the water.
Yes, so that there's just calm above the surface.
Yep, no one sees it. No one sees it.
So we have a traditional first question on the show, which is, of course, as you might expect, about divination. So the first question is, what was your first exposure to divination in your life? Was it something that in your family there was someone who, read cards or was an astrologer or something, or did you come to divination a little later in your life?
So I remember exactly the moment it happened. I grew up in a little town called Frederick, Maryland, which is a much bigger town now. But when I was a child, it was a little small town. And there was a gift shop there called Flights of Fancy that was not exactly a metaphysical store, right? It was like a gift shop that also had incense and sometimes some crystals. It was like that. This was the 80s, so we weren't out yet, but now as an adult, of course, I'm like, oh, I have questions about the owners. So I walked in, I was 12 years old, and I am not exactly sure what came into my head, but I saw a deck of tarot cards on their display shelf and I just knew I had to have it. Just down to my bones, knew I had to have it, saved up my allowance for weeks, which again, it was the 80s, so it was like a $12 tarot deck. Back then you got like $1 a week. So it took a little bit to build up money, and then I went and bought that tarot deck. It was Tarot of the Spirit was the one that I bought, and then I used that deck for 17 years. And I was a weird kid. A lot of people who are metaphysical folk are strange children by nature. So I would sit every night after school and just memorize the cards and go through, and then eventually progressed to doing readings for my friends, and then, joined the military. And for people who don't know, the military is a very superstitious organization as a whole. So got a lot of practice then, worked at a new age store, and eventually started being like into the path of a professional tarot reader. Sort of naturally, it grew out of it. But yeah, that was the moment. And it was just one of those compulsions. I couldn't think about anything else. I wanted that freaking tarot deck. So yeah, kudos to me. Like my 12-year-old self ensured my career now. So I'm very grateful to that, that wonderful little kid.
Yes, and that store too. It's also
Yes.
it's very important to give love to those stores. I think many of us have those early memories of that store that wasn't quite a witch store, but it
Right. We weren't there
gave us some
yet, but we
ideas.
were
Yeah.
close.
No, that's really, really lovely. So you mentioned that, of course, you went into the military. You have had you have worn so many different hats in your life and the various
That's right.
careers that you have been through. Can you give us a little bit more about how that initial interest in divination and in spirituality in that sense kind of turned into this more full career that you have now as a high
Sure.
priestess and priestess in the community?
I think um, I think I've always been oriented toward mysticism, even as a child. And I'm really lucky in that I was unchurched, right? My folks had me baptized Presbyterian, and I think, did a little bit of the going through the motions bit with the extended family. But my parents are hippies. And God's love them, right? Like lived in a commune in the 1960s and 70s, full thing. And they were respectable by the time we were growing up, and my sister and I were like old enough to be in society. But that viewpoint never shifted. And so I sometimes joke that I was raised by wolves. And what I really mean is I was kind of raised outside the standards of society, which means that mystical experiences were never crushed out of me. And I think that that's probably one of the greatest strengths that I bring to this field in general, is that I've had an unusual gift in my life just by virtue of the sheer luck of parentage. So even in the military, in the Bloody Marine Corps, I was still like, finding other pagans and leading rituals and doing transcendental meditation and that entire thing, because it's kind of just part of how I move through the world. So, as a little kid, I would lie on the ground and listen to the song that I could hear within the earth, and that never really changed. So I would say that, finding divination ended up really leading me, I think, further into witchcraft, and then witchcraft turned the volume up on that. But I think what's interesting is that I've always come back not just to paganism, but to organizing groups within it. For me, I really love the experience of working with other witches. Like I absolutely adore that. I love the feeling of potent and powerful group ritual. And I think as a weird, lonely kid, I also just really wanted community. I wanted friends, a peer group, like that was not to be had for a strange little 12-year-old dragging around a tarot deck in Frederick, Maryland in 1980s. Like that was not, I didn't have other kids like me. So I think that all of those sort of coming together are part of how I've ended up stepping back into various forms of community organization and service over the years, and that eventually just sort of built into the career that I have now. It's been I would say, a very natural progression. I ended up having to go full time in witchcraft because I'd been a yoga studio manager and a yoga teacher, and I very suddenly took an injury. And that's one of those fields where there is no net. There's none. Like we don't get time off. There are no health practices. We don't have workers' comp. That's not a thing in that field. So I was suddenly faced with like, okay, your income is gone and you cannot get on the mat for 3 months, absolute minimum. And fortunately, I had a friend who helps launch small businesses who was basically like, your brand as a witch is very, very strong. I have an idea. And so he helped me kind of launch the cottage, which is now what I do full time. So yeah, that's kind of the path that it took.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always very interesting to hear, how these things move us along the path, how we
Very
move
much
the
so.
path for ourselves, but then it also like we get the right people placed near us at the right time. And then you make the community that you needed when you were younger. You sort of build that out for
Very much
yourself.
so. Yes, I love the meme that goes around that like you are the adult that you needed when you
Mhm.
were a child.
Yeah.
And I know that that's not universally true, but for me, that absolutely lands completely on my heart because I'm like, oh no, I am absolutely like I'm the grown up that the 12-year-old me needed. So yeah, and I love the the sense of predestination also I think is very, very real. Like I joke a lot that Save is stalking me. Like whether I want that or not, it's coming for me. So
Yes. And that, yeah, so then turning from that kind of creating community and creating that space to be able to do work for others using what you were already doing as a witch, obviously. Um, I got to experience and be at a fantastic Seidr ritual that you ran with many of members of your team at the Sacred Space Conference. Denise and I were very happy to be there. And some people, we've had Seidr practitioners on the show before, but for some people who may not be really, up on what that even word means that we are throwing around, could you just kind of give us tiny info on
yes, I
what
will
that
I will
is
try to
first?
do it very, very small, very small, very, very wide field, very small
Oh,
definition
very,
if we
yes.
can. Yeah. So, Save is, we would say, Nordic Germanic witchcraft. We could argue that it's the oldest form of witchcraft that comes to us from Europe. It's truly ancient. It looks like our word witch may come from sort of Proto-Germanic language. And it's the magic of that world. It's a little bit like we would say witchcraft in the United States, and people go, oh, right, witchcraft, this huge body of information. Oh, right. Save is very similar. The one that most people are familiar with within wider pagan culture is oracular save, which is one piece of a very large magical practice. It would be a little bit like saying that modern paganism is all just the Ostara ritual. So it's good to, I think, to understand that like save is wide. It includes all sorts of forms of prophecy and divination and war magic and the influencing of luck and very much working with spirits. It's the old Nordic world was highly animistic, so there's that entire piece. There's working with the dead. Like it's an absolutely massive field.
Yes, absolutely. So that the ritual, to be clear, was oracular save in
That's
nature,
right.
Bay or oracular save. Um, what was your first entryway into? You said mentioned it was stalking you. Can you maybe share some ways that it stalked you and
Sure,
how you got started?
absolutely. I think that we have that metaphysical, well, not so much metaphysical, but transcendental experiences are sometimes ones that we seek out, and sometimes are ones that like attack us in an alley, and then you wake up covered in feathers, right? Like this is my experience of coming into the service of Freya, who's one of the Norse goddesses, and who is very much associated with the practice of magic. I would say it's one of her core traits, sort of like, seership and sorcery and battle and a side of love is very much that particular deity. So that happened first. And then I went to a sacred space conference and I went to a save ritual. And I went, oh my God, I want this. I want to know how this is amazing. I want to know how this is done. I want it now. And fortunately, there was a training coming up soon. So I was originally trained in the Rafnar tradition, and then worked with a guild that was Rafnar for years, and then everything kind of exploded last spring. And I'd wanted to create my own ritual for a long time, simply because I had some I felt like the Rafnar ritual needed to be updated, right? I wanted something that was much more firmly seated in the lore. My spouse and I are heathenry nerds, which means we love to be able to be like, oh, right, this comes from the saga of Hervor and Hedrick. We can cite this place right here. And so we wanted something that was more historically oriented and also seated firmly in the one of the Nordic landscapes. The entire sort of space that ritual is built around is a real place in Iceland. So it's one of those ones where we just wanted it really firmly seated and we wanted it to be in contemporary language. Um, there's I think, a thing that happens not so much now, but did in the like call it 70s, 80s, 90s era witchcraft, where we all thought if we used an English accent and did a lot of these and thous, it would sound more realistic. And of course, this is not actually how our ancient kin of faith spoke. They spoke in contemporary language. And so I also wanted to like, let's just pull the fake spear out. We don't need that. That's not helping anyone. So my spouse and I sat down and covered our dining room table with books and built the Seidr ritual that you see now. It went through many rounds of testing with our team, which is wonderful. It still gets revised periodically. I wanted it to be a living ritual. I wanted it to be able to adapt so that, we learned things at Sacred Space. We'd never had 200 people at a Seidr ritual before. We learned some things. It's very different than doing one for 50.
Yeah, no, and I think that that point of it being a living thing is really important. I mean, for a number of people that were at that conference, and I think a lot of us doing this work, I do it more from a Greek context, but it is the kind of thing where, of course, these things are ancient and they have thousands of years of tradition. And I wish that we had unbroken lines.
Yeah, that'd be so nice. Wouldn't that be
Yeah,
nice?
yeah. So we have to walk that line of saying it needs to be informed by the lore. We need to be very respectful of the lore, and also then say, how does this work in the modern world for modern people?
That's right.
Without saying like, oh, invented whole cloth. You can, but oh,
Yeah, no, deep roots but soaring branches
oh yeah.
tends to be how I think of it, right? Like we're still expanding. And there's so much that is different now, right? Like, if we look at one of the most well covered oracular rituals out of the lore, when the seeress arrives, she is given like a bowl of all of the hearts of the different creatures that live on the land and then eats those. I'm not doing that. That sounds disgusting. We're not like it's wholly impractical. Some of my seers are vegetarian. That's not a thing that's going to happen. So,
Mhm.
we need to be able to adapt and meet this moment. And I think that it's also highly reflective of the fact that Seidr was never a unified practice. There was nothing unified about the Nordic world at all. We're talking about a 1500-year time span that covered 5 countries and a part of the world where they did a lot of traveling, and also there would be vast parts of the year where no one left home because there were 3 feet of snow on the ground and the winds could kill you. So different forms of this magic took place. It's part of why when we find the graves of ritual specialists, they vary a lot. They'll have kind of the same kinds of things, but the grave goods are never identical. It's obvious that there were many different expressions of save over the course of a long period of time.
Yeah. Yeah, that is also very, very true. And it's easy to get sort of locked in, I think, sometimes as modern practitioners with the things that have been featured in the lore that either remains, what we do have, which is slivers, or for like the Greek context, the things that were featured because they happen to come from areas where written documents still exist, whereas other practices from other parts of that same ancient world just we don't have it. So that was just as
Yeah.
good, but we don't have the records as much. So, and as you mentioned, doing it in different contexts for different groups of people can be very different. So you had quite a large gathering for that ritual that I happen to be present at, which I'm very happy about. How do you and your team feel that the presentation of these rituals kind of differs depending on where you do them? And I mean, do you have thoughts on how, as because some people who are listening may be practitioners of works like this, how do you think about preparing yourself when you don't necessarily know who's going to show up and what that space is exactly going to feel like when you get there?
Yes. So we use the team's function within our ritual team. So there are a group of people that are specifically tasked managing the space. And that was one of those ones where we learned a little bit this time, where I think I have the privilege of working out of a Unitarian Universalist congregation. I'm the president of Frederick CUUPS. I'm a commissioned Unitarian Universalist lay minister. And because of that, most of my work has been out of that building, right? Which is out on 7 acres of land and has spirits and a spiritual polyculture there that I've been involved with for 15 years, right? Like we've built this wonderful layer of connection. And so doing a large oracular ritual there is fairly easy because our spiritual polyculture is already bonded to all of us as a team. This is where most of us were trained. It's where we regularly practice. There's a deep bond there. So let's take that same team of people and let's put them in a random hotel in toward the city with 200 practitioners, most of whom we don't fucking know, right? Like, wow, okay. So, no, we discovered that we're adding a couple more layers essentially of protection just because we hadn't thought through how that was going to work. We obviously, if you look at the ritual layout, of course, there's always offerings to the spirits of place that are already present. We contain the space, we ring it with light. We do essentially like a variation on the land taking, right? Where you carry flame around the boundary of the property. We do a ton of offerings. There's a lot of protective work, but we really did notice that I think the sheer volume of people and the fact that when you're dealing with intermediate to advanced practitioners, they show up with their own spirits, like that piece was a little bit clunkier to hold for that team of sort of the space management folks. So we learned a lot there. On like the seer side, I was never so grateful for the fact that the role of our seers, and I was in one of the seer roles that evening, is maintain your trance. That's it. Like, we come in and we help set up, but then the seers go off into a corner. There's a specific meditation that I developed that we do. And then our job is to stay liminal. That's the only thing we do. So one of the funny things about talking about the ritual afterwards is I remember parts of it. Not all of it, little bits and pieces. I remember at one point in time being like, oh, this feels like a lot of people, like having that moment. But I think this is also part of why working with the same group of people, if you're doing this form of ritual for a while, is really good, because I really trust my team. Like, I know that no matter what comes up, they'll be able to handle it. And also, we always do a postmortem afterwards. So like, one of the things that's going into the ritual now is at the very end, to clear the space completely, we're going to just use wrangles, and all of my guardians are going to walk that space and shake out anything remaining. Because the other thing we noticed is that space still felt more charged than it does when we're working at home. And we wanted to make sure that didn't happen, because especially at a metaphysical conference, you've got somebody else coming in that is also going to need that room, and it's best not to leave it still fucking tingling. So yeah, we we learned a few things.
Yeah, yeah. I just want to stress, you were bringing up a lot of very important points. It was incredibly, powerful and super well. I don't want anyone to walk away from this thinking, oh wow, so they had a lot of issues. No, it was fantastic, obviously.
You would never know.
Exactly. No. But
we're solid. You wouldn't know, but yeah,
oh,
we
yeah,
always learn.
yeah. And I think that is an interesting piece for myself and my cohort priestess when we do this, that community aspect and that importance of having the trust of the people around you that you can rely on is really, really important. And that is in some ways a little different. That's where, this form of doing this type of, trance-based work is different from, oh, I'm going to sit down with my tarot cards. And, you can do that by yourself. That is a more solitary practice, whereas some of these things are not. In terms of how you cultivated that, of course, you studied in the Hrafnar. I mean, we have Denise studied that as well. So, and we've had other people on. It's a beautiful background for it. For other people who feel that they might be called to do something that is trance-based, do you have any advice or things outside of find a good teacher, which I think kind of is that? But
yeah, find a good teacher is real.
Yeah.
What I would say is that from my experience, if you're interested in trance-based work and oracular work in general, all of the divination and psychic training works in terms of opening and strengthening that ability. Like, I think part of why I was able to step into seership work is simply because I'd spent the previous 20 years on pretty intense divination. So anything that you can do that helps open and strengthen that is useful. And then also, it's the unfortunate thing with heathenry. I'm about to be like, and also read these things here, do your homework. Here's a stack of books to go through, right? But one thing that is common within heathen magic is prediction in general, in various forms, right? Like, we always have prophetic dreams and people speaking prophecies, even when they're not seers or ritual specialists. This is a big part of the world. So anything you can do to enhance your dreaming work is going to help it. And I think it's also useful to know that any construction of save, any construction that you are experiencing or studying a teacher with, none of it is historically fully grounded, because we are all rebuilding from scraps. There is no continued legacy. Whatever you're working with is going to be half, and maybe even more than half, filling the gaps with other things. So it's also okay to go and do a bunch of reading on what the archaeological record says. The book Norse Sorceress is very good for this. It's basically all academic essays largely around what we know from the burials of our ritual specialists and what that can tell us about maybe what a practice might look like. And it's also good to know that every written source we have, particularly with on the Norse and Nordic side, is a secondary source, right? One of my favorite teachers of Seidr and of all things heathen is Trey Moonwood, and they refer to it as muddled monks, right? A lot of this was written down by muddled monks who were probably trying their best, but it was already 200 years after everything had happened, and then we have these Christian functionaries who are like, they say she was wearing cat skin. We're not sure. We're just going to write that down, right? Like there's a challenge here. So I think it is worth knowing that all Seidr construction is contemporary. All of it is a rooting into the past, but it is not a direct line. So it's okay to get in there and use your other metaphysical skills to fill in the blanks. I was trained in spirit work, which means that I use a lot of that to mimic what we think we know about the spirit work of the Völdr. But we don't know for sure. None of them wrote it down, or if they did, it didn't survive. We have guesses. We know that they sent spirits out. Who were the spirits? What were they made of? Was it part of the heathen soul? Were they external spirits? No one fucking knows. We're trying our very best. So it's okay to fill in the blanks. Basically, I'd say, read some of the mythology and the histories and get into the archaeology because weirdly it's more informative, particularly for Seidr than many of the written records are. And it's less biased. Again, not muddled monks writing it down, contemporary archaeologists being like, okay, so this grave definitely had a whole bunch of miniature chair figurines in it and expensive beads from weird parts of the world and a giant metal staff. That's a ritual specialist. What can we build from there? So yeah, I'd say, if you're interested in Seidr, it can be done independently. Big oracular rituals are just safer with the group. You could technically do it on your own. I wouldn't want to. It's safer to have a cushion.
Yes, absolutely. No, and that's very, I think, very good advice for all these things because it's very easy to sort of chunk out this information or say, I found it in a book, and you did find it in a book. But if you don't have the context, then that can be a little misleading. And so
Yes.
that can be a little overwhelming too to say, well, read 300 books. Not quite, but do what you can to get some form of cultural context around it so that you have a better place to slot this stuff in. And that is also, I love Gwendolyn Reese, also sacred space person. She uses the rebirthing as opposed to reconstructing. And I am totally going to be saying that a lot to people because I think that is
absolutely
what we're talking about here.
Many times we talk about heathen revivalism. Like my spouse and I are not recons. We are revivalists, very much so, but the same concept of like, we're bringing this back to life and in a new way, with some additional Frankenstein parts because some were missing. So we do what we have to.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, we could go, believe me, I have lots of other questions. We could just talk about the Seidr portion for several hours. Maybe that will be for another show when you come back. We'll do more of this. But it also speaks to other aspects of your practice, which is when we're putting these things together and we are thinking about forming communities around these practices. You have done a lot of that work, as you mentioned, as a minister within CUUPS, where you are in the community, as well as your work with the Sacred Space Conference. You just put out, at the time of recording, a blog post about the importance of pluralism in the modern pagan community. I could not agree more. And it is interesting to me that you're coming from a heathen, background as well as witchcraft. Could you speak to maybe what you've noticed from having been a part of this Sacred Space Conference now, I'm sure for quite a period, and how that speaks to what you think modern pagans or practitioners should keep in mind about how we are trying to make community together?
Yes. So I would say that one of the interesting things about working in interfaith spaces and representing, I sometimes am called, well, fairly regularly, I'm called upon to represent either paganism or heathenry outside of our spaces. And I think it is worth understanding that we have real enemies. And there really are people who, I'm not saying they would come and like burn down the Covenstead, but they would be indifferent if we were made illegal. And they would not stop necessarily someone from making sure that we knew that, right? Like there is a very real force that would prefer we don't exist. One of the events I run is the Frederick, Maryland Pagan Pride Day, which is a fairly large regional pride. It draws about 700 people. And we run it out of the congregation that I serve. We're lucky. We're out on, 7 acres of land. We got the space for a festival. And almost every year, my congregation gets really shitty voice messages and really threatening emails from what is considered a fairly liberal region, right? Like the Frederick area is known for its arts scene and lots of vegetarian restaurants. Like this is in, the blue region. And also, we have real problems outside of our community. And so some of why pluralism and bridge building is so important to me is just that we're not, you know, we need each other. Now more than ever, especially since the Venn diagram of like queer identified and pagan is basically just one sort of lumpy circle, right? Like that's most of us. and and with everything happening with discrimination against queer people, like there's this other layer of like, we really need to be building very strong bonds between us. Along with that, I find that being exposed to different practices that fall under the category of metaphysics or paganism, I'm never sorry. I've learned something new. And I would love it if we all kind of took the philosophy of either ambassadorship or being sort of like an explorer, like put that hat on instead. It's okay if it doesn't work for you. Like the worst thing that's happened is you've gone to a ritual and you didn't have a transcendental experience or feel anything. Okay, what else did you learn? I've been to many rituals where they're not for me. And also, that's totally okay. I've always learned something and been better able to relate to the practitioners who follow that path. Chaos magic, not my thing, but I have a lot of chaos magician friends that I love. And so learning about their systems has never hurt me. It's been useful. And I think if we can bring this spirit of curiosity and conscious sort of, bridging across tradition, it does nothing but help us. And it might very well keep us safe as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is really important. It was beautiful to see at that conference, and I've heard from a number of people, affiliated with other conferences, that the interest levels in that seem to be getting higher and higher, which is really wonderful because there's sort of this pulling apart of people being able to do what they want to do from, what you can learn online, which is wonderful and amazing. But then there is also that call and that need that we actually were speaking about at the beginning of the interview of,
yes,
that need for
community.
community and that pulling
Absolutely.
back together in a sense. So that is, yeah, that's really lovely. And you clearly have a lot of experience with that since you are working in a multi-denominational, congregation professionally. I also feel that what you were saying about pluralism and that learning from other traditions also is a part of having strong magical and divinatory practices, because when you are exposed to new ideas or new ways of posing questions or new ways of interpreting or thinking with the spirits that you're asking those questions, it can't do anything but help your results, to say the
Right.
least. Are there things that you feel have influenced the way that, even though, of course, as you've mentioned, the Seidr work and your work in that field is very much, firmly based in the lore and also the traditions you learned from. But are there things that you could say, yes, it was because I was exposed to this other very different style of divination or style of oracular practice that we added this little piece or something like that? Do you know what I mean?
Oh gosh, yeah. Like it's one of those things where I sometimes, so I'm Crow and sort of Corvid affiliated, right?
Ah,
And I
yes.
sometimes joke because I don't actually have a lot of things, right? Like,
Mhm.
contrary to the overflowing bookshelves behind me, I tend to be like, if I'm not using it, it gets passed on. I don't like stuff not serving its purpose. But what I do hoard is information and experiences. And I
Mhm.
love having these little chests to pull things from. There are so many pieces. I would say less with Say than more with my service to the wider pagan community. A cups chapter is an open community by its very, very nature, right? Like it is designed to meet lots of needs. And so the way we do high holiday rituals is very expansively. They're not one specific tradition. We tend to be very focused on the global themes of like what season is it now? What is the natural world doing around us? What emotions are stirring in us? What is the core emotional truth of this holiday? Because that is shared even if say the specifics of a deity associated with the holiday are not. And what I would say is that being exposed to lots of different rituals, little things, where I'm like, oh, I'm taking that, it's going in the Samhain ritual. Oh, this little piece is going over here. So yes, I would say so many pieces that I
I
I can't
know,
even give
trying
you
to
like
pull one
one or
out
two,
now.
right? Exactly. Well, and it's also, it's years of seeing rituals done. Like I do remember there was one a long time ago that I think it was a circle sanctuary ritual, and the way they cast circle was, my name is whatever, hand to hand, the circle is cast. I was like, what a beautiful community expression of being able to hear everyone's name. Yoink! And then that went into Frederick CUUPS rituals, right? Like
Yep.
all of these little pieces of seeing how other people do things ultimately become part of your expression of witchcraft. And I think one of the benefits of moving in community does mean that Frederick CUUPS, and I think part of why it is such a successful CUUPS chapter, is that it is so broad. You can come in and you can have an experience and not feel like your particular practice is being shunted or pushed aside. And then within Frederick CUUPS, we also have subgroups. So there are, a set of heathens, we have a set of Celts, we have a set of Hellenic practitioners. And so then you can also do your specific practice while feeling welcome at the large community rituals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that is really lovely. And also having the containers where that's appropriate, and then the ability to come together for things that are, larger
More
scale, like
specific. Yeah,
Pagan Pride and other things like that. That's
exactly.
beautiful. So you've kind of already touched on this in a number of ways, but is there anything in particular that if somebody's listening who's like, oh, well, I'm trying to put together a group or I'm in the middle of doing a thing, and what advice or things that you've done wrong in the past or you've seen
Oh
other people
God.
do wrong? Because
Sure.
I know that
How
sometimes
long
my
do you have?
mistake stories can be both fun and informative.
I'm a musician as well. I'm in a band called
Oh, I
Kindred
was going to
Crow, and
ask
I've
you about
been,
that too.
yeah, no, so I've been a pagan musician for 11 billion years. The very first pagan band I was in when I got back from the military, my late father played guitar in, like I said, parents were hippies. It was called Revel Moon. And we toured Pagan Pride Days. And part of why there's a Pagan Pride Day in Frederick is that I wanted to demonstrate it could be run well. Like one of these can be done in a very organized fashion. The other thing that is true of me is like a very strong type A. I fucking love spreadsheets and flowcharts. Like that's the other half of the brain. So it's very much like I'm going to do this right just to prove it can be done. So what I will say about long term running of events and organizations, if you are interfacing with the public, start with one thing and get really good at it, and then add another thing. The biggest thing I see younger practitioners or younger people who are younger in community service doing that I think causes them sort of self inflicted injuries is trying to do too much. Build slowly and stable. Frederick Pagan Pride Day, the very first year we had, I think I'd expected 100 people and we ended up with like 350. And we've just like steadily added 100 every year, right? Just stacking up and becoming more and more elaborate. When I got involved with Frederick CUUPS, that was about 15 years ago now. I've been in leadership there for, I think, about 10 at this point. We had 4 or 5 people at high holiday rituals. Like it was not unusual to, the largest ritual of the year would have 20. The largest ritual of the year now has over 200. So steady, but we didn't try to grow that big that fast, right? Instead, we got really good at doing the high holiday rituals of the year and one earth service per month. And then we added on, and then we added on, and then we added on. And that I think is this sort of like long game philosophy is one of the best things I can hand off. So that piece and then accessibility, please. Again, if you're interfacing with the public, right? This is huge. And in multiple different ways, you say the word accessibility and everybody thinks, oh, for wheelchair users or people who have canes. No, neurodiversity is a big accessibility piece that we need to be thinking about right now. Making rituals trauma informed is a big accessibility piece, right? There is so much to consider. So begin to, one, competency, and two, make it easy for people to step in. making things accessible for parents with young children is a huge area of focus in my own life, simply because the folks who are young parents right now are actively parenting for more hours and are actively working more hours than any previous generation, right? Like they are absolutely crushed. So getting to the point where we can even just get them to a ritual involves additional support. So I'd say that, like, those are probably the two main things that I'd pass on, is like these are useful to think about. Grow slow, competency, just because there is so much now. If your ritual sucks or doesn't feel welcoming, people just won't come back. like like the half-assed thing that I think some organizations can get into the habit of doing, of not having planned this out well or visioned it well, that's not it's not going to work anymore. Back in the 80s and 90s, we were all just so fucking glad to meet other pagans that we would put up with anything. And I'm 1,000% like, yeah, me too. I stayed in groups and with organizations that I wouldn't now, because I know it doesn't have to be like that. Like it's a different world now. Offer good, reliable, um, steady programming. Get better at it over time, add things in over time as you have the bodies and the energy to do so, and remember who you're trying to reach, right? The pagan community, we do occupy many of the margins of society, whether we're talking about money or ableism or skin color or queer identification, right? We occupy that liminal space. So making sure we're just addressing that. I think those would be the two big things I'd suggest.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful and important advice. Um, and I think it also ties into when you're talking about going slowly and taking your time in growing. That also brings up the idea of how we grow into any of these practices. By taking our
Right.
time and maybe so. I'm an Aries, so sometimes like slow. What is the slow?
Slow is boring.
Oh, oh, now. But I'm just curious what your thoughts are on. You already, of course, gave excellent advice on the basics of how people should think with going into seer practices, if that's something that they are interested in. How do you incorporate divination outside of seer work into your practice? Just as
Oh,
a
sure.
first starter question there.
I'm a daily practice person, or let's call it a regular practice. I don't think any of us are like legit daily. Well, okay, there might be some exceptions to I fall off the wagon at least once or twice a week, right? But most days of the week, I start with a tarot card pull, and a lot of it is just what is a good message for today. So that is a part of my regular practice. My regular practice, because I am a save worker, includes connecting with the land that I belong to. So the other thing that happens is I step outside. I have 3 spots on the land that I belong to that I visit. And it's not even to have like a huge fucking conversation. It's more just like, hi, good morning, I love you, right? And then I do 5 minutes of meditation. I work with a Seidr staff, so that is a piece of it. It's not huge, right? Whole thing, tarot card, step outside, 5 minutes of meditation, 15 minutes, maybe. It's not a massive investment of time. It makes a huge difference. And then along with that, of course, there are other pieces that you add in when you do have time. So I've been working on growing more. I have about 3 acres out in the country with a pretty large vegetable garden. So I've been adding more things to that garden that are associated with prophetic dreams, with psychic ability in general, to also support this practice. So I think perhaps what I'm trying to get to is build yourself a daily cycle that doesn't take a whole lot of time, because all of us are trying to survive late stage failed capitalist hellscape, but choose a few things that then support the kind of witchcraft you wish to perform. So if what you want is a really strong divination practice, all of that is available. So, maybe your daily visit outside is to a mugwort plant, which is in a pot and not in the ground, kids. That thing spreads. But maybe it's to a mugwort plant that you will then turn into tea, or to, a horsetail plant, which is called draumagras, dream grass, literally in Icelandic. Maybe that's the piece. And maybe then we do, rather than one tarot card, maybe we do 3. Like, focus on what it is you're trying to open and strengthen.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That is it's also important that that's a part of that accessibility, which is not saying that there are not things that are prerequisites that just, well, if you want to do the thing, you have to have the technique to do it. I mean, you're a musician, I'm a musician. There are things that you just have to learn how
You
to do.
have to. Yeah.
But that also doesn't mean that can't be different for different people, even though the requirements are there, how it shows up in someone's life and how they do it might look different
Yeah,
based on where they are. Um,
absolutely.
yeah.
I have a dear friend that lives in Brooklyn. Her
Mhm.
experience of nature and connection wildly different than my own, and also completely correct for where she lives.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting to me that we are both musicians who both do this kind of seer work. And I am curious what your thoughts are about I don't even know quite how to phrase this question. I will just put it that way about connections between the work of kind of being able to do the work of divination, or more specifically, trance-based prophecy, and the act of being a musician or being in creative space like that.
I actually think that being a musician is part of why I was able to pick up seership pretty quickly.
Hmm.
So for many of us, not all, but for many musicians, we there's a flow state that we get into where the music is coming through you or the lyrics are coming through you in a very fluid way, but you're not really thinking about making them. And this is also where technique comes in that you have to have the technique first before the flow state hits, or you can't really support the flow state, right? So my 20 years in classical voice is part of why I can control my voice the way I can and why it can be used now as an instrument, right? Like all of those years of playing penny whistle means that I can just close my eyes and a melody comes through. It's a trance state, a light one, but I think it really is. And for me, the process of writing lyrics has largely been that where I'll sit down. I always describe it as sort of mentally falling backwards, like you just allow yourself to be caught, and then whatever comes through, comes through. And I think that that is part of why seership was easy to pick up, simply because I have this long practice of supporting a flow state. You know, my spouse is an amazing guitar player. Like, honestly, anything with strings, they're one of those annoying humans where you can give them something that's guitar shaped from whatever culture in the world and they can make a beautiful sound on it. And it's just like, it's whatever, you know, yeah, fine, I'm going to go burn my guitar in the backyard. Like, they're incredible. But same thing where they'll just sort of catch a wave and it flows through them. So I really do think those things are connected. And we have a little bit of attestation, at least within the Nordic world, that that might have been true on a fairly wide scale, in that much of the magic of Save, we know that songs were involved, that singing drew the spirits. There is a theory that Kulnink, that process of calling in the cattle, might something similar might have happened to call in the spirits. And we actually utilize Kulnink in Gravalor Save for that reason. While there's a spirit summoning song that's happening, anybody who can do Kulning at Sacred Space, it was me, but it's a few different ones of us, will also do those high calling sounds to call the spirits in. So I think that there's a definite thread of connection between this one form of mysticism and this other one.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And through that flow state or inspired state, that's kin on many different levels. And I also think that I've known some people who have it through martial arts or through other
Yes.
practices that require or encourage that flow state through some form of dedicated technique that then gradually turns into the art through some magical process. Magical
Right.
being very much the word. That is really beautiful. I was curious, I always want to ask people their opinions on what it means to do this work on behalf of others as opposed to on behalf of yourself. Because, when you're doing trance and this type of work, it is, while it serves us in a way, of course, we are getting amazing things out of it. There is community service very much involved in it if other people are going to ask you questions. Do you have thoughts about how that connects to like doing tarot readings for other people? Like, how do you
Yes.
think about that process of helping people come to you for those questions, whether it's through trance or through tarot or something else?
When I train seers and when I train divinators, I focus a lot on the ethics of it simply because it's important to understand that that when you are in these rituals or simply in the space of doing a tarot reading for someone, your words carry so much weight, so much weight. And I very much encourage fairly strong purification and alignment practices if you choose to be in this field, simply because we cannot risk our personal bullshit and our biases getting in the way. The potential for negative outcomes is immense if we have a seer or a divinator who's kind of out of control or acting from a place of imbalance. And I'm not saying you have to be perfect. I'm mentally ill. I take meds to keep it under control, right? But we need to be well to the best level we can be, and we need to be taking full responsibility for our actions here. And I think it's just such an important part of, like, this is an act of service, more than anything else. My own experience of oracular work certainly is I'm usually fried afterwards, right? I'm done. I'm toast. That's it for the rest of the day. At Sacred Space, Mortellus had a ritual coming in right after mine. I would have loved to have gone to that. No, I went to my hotel room and turned into a puddle. Like, you are offering deeply of yourself so that your community can get the help that it needs, the messages that it needs. But the onus of responsibility on the seer is immense, on the divinator is immense. And so just understanding the ethical implications here is absolutely vital. Know where your lines are. We have an emergency, in case of emergency, break glass line within the ritual that our guide, the person who does most of the talking, will use if in the case of a question that is asked that is inappropriate.
Mhm.
Simply because we have to have someone in the room with some guardrails, making sure everyone stays safe.
Yeah, yeah, it's very, very important. Um, as we move more towards the close of this interview, I always like to leave space for what you think is a message that has either been something you find yourself kind of repeating a lot to people or thinking about a lot as sort of, I don't want to call it general advice, but general things that you think it would help people to keep in mind right now, just in this moment.
Sure. So one of the nice things about doing tarot for a living and doing a lot of pastoral counseling is that it tends to mean that I get a lot of the theme of whatever's going on in the greater community because the same questions show up, over the same week. And a lot of it right now is just how to cope, right?
Mhm.
Just how do we get through? And so one of the things that I find I'm repeating a lot right now is that your spiritual practice is lots of fun when everything is easy. And it too is easy to do, but your spiritual practice is what will save your ass when things get hard because it is the one consistent thing in life.
Mhm.
Show up, go through the motions. Like, one of the most useful things that comes from the more disciplined sort of area of spiritual training I have is I don't care if you don't feel like doing your practice. Do it anyway. Usually, by halfway through, you've remembered why you're in front of the altar, but literally make yourself do it. You're not going to want to. And this comes out of being a yoga teacher as well. We always say that the hardest sort of 90% of a practice is getting up and getting on the mat. Once you're there, it's easy. You'll do the practice because you're already standing barefoot on your yoga mat. You might as well do it. Getting to the mat is the hardest part. And right now, for all of us, getting to the altar, getting to that spot in your yard, getting to your tarot deck and just making yourself crack it open, that's the hardest part of the practice. Push through. Do it. This really will keep you sane. It'll keep you functional. So I would say that that's one of the big things. And then the other one is a concept that I think of as 10% better. Many things right now are not fixable, not on a wide scale, but we can take the edges off. My therapist would call it picking the low hanging fruit, right? So, what can we do that makes this easier? What can we do that makes this just a little bit softer? Sort of like, what perspective can we change that opens this just a little more? And this kind of circles us back to community, right? Like, making enough time with your friends and the community that you love, making enough time to do the things that you love, remembering that while we are all fighting for justice and equity and calling our senators and all of the very hard work that everyone's doing right now, you must still refill the cup. Otherwise, eventually you just spiral down into darkness. It's not sustainable. So I'd say that those two things, those are the big things that I'm talking about with my clients right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That is very, very excellent and important advice, I think, for all of us to keep in mind every day. On the days,
Yeah.
especially when it's easy to forget it.
Yeah, when you don't feel like it, when you just want to curl up into a pile of blankets, solidarity. Like I mentioned, I have anxiety and depression. I feel that strongly. But if you've got it in you, get up and light a stick of incense, do your spiritual practice. That will set you up just a little bit more to get through the day, and then make your fancy coffee, right? Like the 10% better, little things that help soften the edges. Look for the good news. It is out there, but we have to choose to find it. All of these little things to just shift around a bit.
Mhm. Yeah. It's important to not always be looking for the giant stuff, that it is the
Yes,
small moments that actually add up to the big moments. So
right. Yeah,
we
we
show
have
up for
so
the
much
little
history
for
for
those.
this. Yeah, exactly, right? Like the bonds that when we see this in, cultural story after cultural story after cultural story, right? Where we have, the farmstead next door is the one that will help the most. Work with your community directly as much as you can. And it really does help, get off of the internet, interact with people in person, help where you can. Helping actually makes you feel better. So, all of these little things that help take the edges off that make it 10% better.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful way of putting it. So thank you for that. So for people who are curious about, you've mentioned where you are in the world. Um,
Yes.
I will, of course, in the show notes, there'll be a link to your website and stuff like that. But what are the projects that you have coming up, or what are you working on that you can share
Yeah,
with
sure thing. So the easiest way to find me is through my personal website, which is Glasswitch Cottage, and it's glass with an E on the end because Irish Gaelic names have letters we don't pronounce for funsies. Um, but that's the easiest way to find me. I have two books coming out through Cross Crow next year. So those are part of the magical system that I've been teaching that is not safe, but is just straight up witchcraft and spirit work for about 5 years out of Frederick. So I'm looking forward to those coming out. I am working on a Heathenry project for another publisher, and I think that that's where I'll leave that for the moment.
Cool.
Um, I am very active in the Western Maryland community. So if you come through the region, please always feel welcome. Frederick CUUPS is an open community. The Sacred Space Conference next year, which happens in the DC region overall every year, is the merged conference, which with Between the Worlds. That one's going to be in February. If you are at all able to attend that, I cannot recommend it highly enough. Like, I have seen much of the guest list. I promise you would like to be there. Like, they're both really good intermediate to advanced conferences. And then when we merge, it's basically, would you like to be in a space with the top 20 Llewellyn authors? Like,
Yeah.
here they all are, like that's the vibe. It is an incredible opportunity to learn. So I definitely recommend that. Um, but
Very
yeah,
awesome.
basically, if you're in the Maryland, Virginia, DC area, you will run into me at some point in time. I have my fingers in all of the regional pies, so, and I
I love
have
it.
for years.
Yeah. That's very cool. Well, it would be lovely to have you back on to talk about your projects in the future. And I am so very happy to have had this conversation with you after we saw each other in person, and hopefully we'll see each other in person many times again. So thank you so
That would
much
be
for your
lovely.
time.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been delightful. I'm always excited to have an opportunity to info dump with someone who gets it.
We stick together. We know when we find each other. So
Like, oh, good, someone else who's obsessed with the same or similar things. Hooray!